Well, good morning and welcome. Welcome to the second LAS Faculty Research Symposium, Migration in a World of Walls and Borders. I'm Lisa Freeman, the Interim Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here in Chicago on this spectacularly beautiful spring day. I think we're headed back to winter next week, so we have to enjoy it. As many of you know, one of my goals as interim dean has been to recognize and celebrate the truly extraordinary work that our faculty are doing on issues that matter to the common good. Once we identified a theme for this second symposium, I asked the head of Latin American and Latino Studies, Jonathan Inda, to plan a symposium that would showcase the excellent work that our faculty do around this topic and to bring them into conversation with other experts across the country. Jonathan convened an interdisciplinary committee who came up with the impressive program before us today, and it's a beautiful program, and it's a beautiful image illustrating the program, so thanks for that. The theme of migration is particularly resonant as UIC serves many students who are immigrants or the children or grandchildren of immigrants, and Chicago itself is, of course, home to many immigrant communities. But as you'll see in the titles for each session in your program, migration is at once deeper and more complex than society's dominant narratives about it suggest. At our first symposium a couple of months ago, we considered how climate change requires us to recognize our connectedness in the world. In the same way, migration, whether voluntary or forced, and the resulting plight of those who undertake it, requires us to recognize the many ways in which we erect barriers and block human survival. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is honored not only to support this symposium, but to host several distinguished guests today. Our own faculty represent a range of disciplinary backgrounds and practices and come from the departments of Latin American and Latino Studies, History, Anthropology, English, Global Asian Studies, Criminology, Law and Justice, and Gender and Women's Studies. Our guests, I'm going to introduce some of them, you'll hear from them later today. Cindy Hahamovitch, Professor of History at the University of Georgia, who studies Southern immigration and labor history. William Walters, Professor of Politics in the Department of Political Science and Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and FPA Research Excellence Chair at Carleton University. Karma Chavez, Chair and Endowed Professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latina Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Elvira Arellano, an organizer and human rights activist from Michoacan. John Lau, Associate Professor in the Department of Comparative Studies at The Ohio State University and Director of Newark Earthworks Center at OSU Newark. Ji-Yun Lee, a Chicago-based interdisciplinary artist who has worked for over 30 years in immigrant rights, economic justice, LGBTQ issues, and domestic violence activism, and our keynote speaker, Valeria Luiselli, who is a 2019 MacArthur Fellow and acclaimed writer. And just that list of folks joining us today it's spectacular and exactly the kind of event we want to have where we're bringing experts across the country to be in conversation with us at UIC. The Dean's Office at LAS is incredibly proud to host Migration in a World of Walls and Borders and to welcome you to our campus. Thank you to the entire staff of LAS, especially Vicki Balf, who you will see throughout the day. Vicki and Kathy keep me sane and do a spectacular job in facilitating events like this. Thank you as well to Jonathan Inda and the faculty committee who worked with him to put together such an amazing program. It's been a real joy to work with you on that. And thank you all for being here. I really can't wait to see what we'll learn from today. And I'm going to turn things over now to Jonathan himself, head of our Latin American and Latino Studies program, Professor Jonathan Inda. He'll get the day started. Thank you so much.
So first of all, thank you, Dean Freeman. and thank you all for being here. My name is Jonathan Inda. I am Director and Professor of Latin American Latino Studies here at UIC. I would like to begin by recognizing and acknowledging that the University of Illinois Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three fire people, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and the Potawatomi. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, and living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. Now, as we work, live, and play in these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization, state violence, forced removal, and support indigenous communities' struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. So this is a fairly short land acknowledgement. Actually, John Lowe, who will be a speaker later on this afternoon, will have an extended discussion of land acknowledgements and their significance, particularly in the context of Chicago. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Interim Dean Lisa Freeman for the initiative to create forums to highlight the wonderful research of faculty in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I too would like to thank the entire staff in LAS for all their work, in particular Vicki Wolf, Vicki, again, who has done really much of the work to bring this symposium together. I also want to thank the organizing committee for imagining this event and for organizing the panels, Soledad Alvarez Velasco, Esmeralda Rizón Palomera, Xóchitl Bada, John Connolly, Andreas Feldman, Ana Guevara, Patricia Macias Rojas, Ivon Padilla Rodriguez, Naomi Paik, Gayatri Reddy, and Barbara Sostaita. Thank you all. Now, just a few words to provide a context for the symposium. So let me begin with the following scene. The date is October 1st, 1994. The setting, a 14-mile stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border running from the Pacific Ocean to the rugged canyons east of the city of San Ysidro, California. This stretch is the busiest undocumented border crossing zone in the nation. As dusk nears, over 150 Border Patrol agents, more than twice the usual number, fan out in an array of vehicles, so from horses, bicycles, sedans, all-terrain vehicles, to military helicopters and small high-speed boats. They fan out along the fields, canyons, riverbanks, and beaches of this tract of border. At first signs of movement, the agents give chase to migrants seeking to cross into the United States. Before the night is over, the U.S. Border Patrol will have made over 800 arrests in this area, more than 3 times the number registered at the same time the previous year. Now, this scene depicts day one of Operation Gatekeeper, which was part of a larger program developed by the U.S. Federal government to strengthen control of the southwest border in order to reduce the flow of undocumented migration from Mexico into the United States. Significantly, the goal of curtailing undocumented migration was directly connected to the ways in which undocumented migrants had been problematized in the U.S., that is, to the manner in which particular knowledges had constructed the undocumented as a problem, as a threat to the well-being of the nation. So, for example, the undocumented were associated with such cultural, social, and economic maladies as overpopulation, crime, deteriorating schools, urban decay, energy shortages, national disunity. Moreover, they were accused of displacing American workers, depressing wages, spreading diseases, and burdening public services. Now, we now think of California as a fairly progressive state when it comes to immigration politics, but in the 1990s, it wasn't the case. And of course, these are also very familiar themes. These are themes that we continue to hear today. Now, I begin with Operation Gatekeeper because it was really a key moment in the policing of migration in the United States. it represented a significant intensification of law enforcement at the nation's borders, and in particular the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is an intensification that very much continues today. The U.S. federal government has essentially determined that the best way to deal with the problem of undocumented immigration is through turning the United States into a fortified enclave of sorts. So since Gatekeeper, the U.S. has continued to amass Border Patrol agents and technology along the U.S.-Mexico border in order to deter undocumented crossings. So we all know about kind of border walls, which were in many ways made famous by Trump, but the building of border walls did not start with Trump. They have a longer history. And in many ways, this urge to turn the U.S. into a fortified enclave has taken place under various types of administrations, both Democrats and. It's hard to hear. Is this not on? Okay. Okay. So I'll project more. So essentially, it hasn't really mattered what. It won't stay up. What political party has been in the White House? Still, the major movement has been to create walls and borders. Now, the other thing that the U.S. Government has done is really place an increasing emphasis on the interior policing of the nation, that is, away from borders. So, for example, local and state law enforcement agencies have become progressively more involved in policing immigration matters. So if someone's undocumented, they get stopped for having a broken taillight, that could end up getting them deported. Criminal prosecutions of immigration violations have increased. The number of migrants incarcerated in county jails and federal prisons and privately run immigration detention centers has surged. And also states have made it more difficult for unauthorized migrants to obtain driver's licenses and other identity documents. And of course, in Florida right now, there has just been a bill introduced that would criminalize anyone who transports someone who's undocumented. And so, so these very kind of repressive policies are very much continuing. So what we have witnessed since Operation Gatekeeper is really the progressive criminalization of migrants and a significant expansion in the space of policing. While the response to migration just discussed is particular to the U.S., the construction of migration as a problem and its hyper-policing is not. Neoliberal global processes, as Joseph Nevins has pointed out, have encouraged economic flows across international borders, so for instance, favoring the accumulation of capital, defense of private rights, free market and free trade, while at the same time maintaining nationalistic political geographic closure across the same borders via expanding boundary enforcement and militarization. Now, these contradictory processes of economic openness and territorial closure have led to ever-increasing movement of both unauthorized and authorized migrants across national borders. But politicians and national populations alike have generally neglected the global economic and structural roots of international migration and have tended to place the responsibility for migration and its consequences squarely on the shoulders of individual migrants. The upshot, nations all over the world have developed generally exclusionary and punitive measures to deal with what they regard as either the migration or the border crisis. The symposium today is very much concerned with this exclusionary impulse in how migration is problematized and managed. At the same time, however, we note that the world cannot be reduced to a space of mere policing. It is also most certainly a site of political struggle. Migrants have not stood idly by and accepted the punitive treatment to which they have been subjected. Rather, they and their allies have actively sought to challenge the ways in which they have been policed. So the symposium is at once about territorial closure and its impact on migrants and migration, and on the ways migrants and their allies have sought to challenge such closures and worked for migrant justice. So the symposium is divided into 4 panels, focusing on labor, immobility, sanctuary, and displacement. The first panel on labor is historical in nature. It highlights the long history of exclusionary migration processes. Specifically, the panel explores the indentured labor migration and at peonage of migrant workers in the post-slavery Caribbean and the 20th century United States. By focusing on the lives, border crossings, and work of people who have inhabited multiple vulnerabilities, especially South Asian migrants and non-citizen Mexican minors, UIC historians John Connolly and Ivon Padilla Rodriguez reveal the increasingly unfree, coercive, and violent labor arrangements imposed upon these workers, as well as what these histories can tell us about labor migration dilemmas in the current moment. Now, our second panel, Immobilities, focuses on how the experience of waiting and being in transit is an important yet under-theorized part of the complex and ever-changing migration dynamics. Specifically, the panel explores how migrants simultaneously experience mobility and immobilization through waiting and in transit spaces. By tuning into the embodied experiences of migrants in transit across the migratory corridors connecting the Americas, entrapped in border spaces along those routes, immobilized in detention centers across the Mexico-US border, in the US, or in shield countries before reaching Europe, the panelists examine the dialectical tension between mobility and immobilization. After our 2 morning panels, we have a lunch roundtable on sanctuary. Now, this roundtable brings together scholars investigating sanctuary as an organizing strategy for migrant justice into conversation with Elvira Arellano, a migrant activist whose case helped launch the new sanctuary movement in the early 2000s. So the roundtable considers sanctuary's ethical and religious roots and its more contemporary iterations for migrant justice, including the 1980s sanctuary movement for Central American migrants, the new sanctuary movement for migrants under threat of deportation, and more recent mobilizations for sanctuary cities, campuses, and congregations. Our final panel focuses on processes of displacement more generally, linking migration to long histories of displacement of racialized communities in the United States and the practices of containment through which they have experienced multiple forms of invisibilization and dispossession. So drawing on archival research, oral history interviews, ancestral lived experience, performative public art, and dance practice, this panel traces the long histories of displacement and the material and immaterial ways in which unbelonging and dispossession are marked on racialized bodies and communities in the United States. And it asks, who belongs in this nation, this state, this neighborhood? What are some of the practices of containment through which racialized communities have experienced multiple forms of invisibilization, displacement, and dispossession? And how do struggles over land, housing, and basic human rights speak back to these ideologies and practices of displacement? Through a range of different media and forms of public engagement, this panel not only serves as a medium for witnessing these struggles, but also visualizes modes of subaltern resistance in response to these sustained efforts at racial segregation, containment, deportation, and state violence. The symposium will conclude with a keynote by acclaimed writer Valeria Luiselli, who's written a number of very powerful books, both fiction and nonfiction, focusing on migration and particularly on child migration. Her keynote will focus on migrant stories. And we will also have a, oops, sorry. Now, to conclude, I just want to thank all of you for coming today. I think we have developed a wonderful program that highlights a key research strength of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We very much hope that you enjoy the symposium, even though I think some of the migration is often a very painful process. So at the very least, we hope you learn from those experiences. So again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the program. So what I would like to do now is transition to our first panel on labor, and if we can have those panelists come up. The panel will be chaired by Professor Xóchitl Bada. Oh, is that what's being?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
Hello, so here so Jonathan.
Yeah, I figured that out.
Logistics. So is every speaker going to speak from here or from there?
The fourth panel, that's what they okay, so yeah.
From there, yeah, I agree. So then now we start coming in.
On the computer?
Since we are super good on time. Okay. You are first, so sit here because you will. And I will take your place because then I'll have to be super close to this.
Okay. And by the way,
Okay, should I turn this one off? Oh. Gotcha.
I think so.
So, you guys may need to lean into the mic a little bit to be heard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Drill try, I'm sure.
So I'll be in the back there. If you see me doing this, that means more volume.
Yes. He's asking if he should use this for
And we can open that up now.
Yeah, you can leave it open and like on pause or something.
It's right here in the folder.
Oh,
There we go.
This is a big turn.
Yeah, I think people are probably
Right.
yeah, we can leave it.
So I'm going to minimize it, and when he wants to,
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Yeah,
At first I was like, oh, no,
Yeah.
but now I'm really
Okay, good morning, everybody. We should get started. Once again, welcome to UIC. I am Xóchitl Bada, an associate professor in the program of Latin American and Latino Studies, here also at UIC. I'm also a member of the Global Immigration Cluster Initiative in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The reason I am chairing this morning is because I recently published a book in January with Shannon Gleason on transnational immigrant labor rights advocacy. The title is Scaling Migrant Labor Rights, How Advocates Collaborate and Contest State Power, published by the University of California Press. You can check it out for free at migrantworkerrights.com. It was published on open access thanks to the American Sociological Association. Let's begin. I am serving as the chair of the panel. Each speaker has 15 minutes, including the discussant. Our first speaker of the morning is Jonathan Connolly, professor at the Department of History, University of Illinois, Chicago. He's currently finishing a book about indentured labor migration from South Asia to the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, and the category of free labor following the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. The book, titled Worthy of Freedom, will be published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. This morning, he will be presenting for us his paper, Indenture, Vagrancy, and Post-Slavery Free Labor in the Era of Emancipation. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Jonathan Connolly.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to give this paper in two parts. I'll start by talking about my historical research, and then I'm just going to try to reflect a bit on possible connections between work about labor migration in the context of empire and then work based on 20th and 21st century contexts. All right. Is this better if I lean in? Yeah, okay. I'm a soft speaker. So let me get started. Following the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, imperial officials created a transcontinental system of indentured labor migration to bring new workers to sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean worlds. Over the course of roughly 80 years, this system operated on a very large scale. Between 1842 and 1917, more than 1 million indentured Indian workers arrived in the British Caribbean, in Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, as well as in southern Africa, Fiji, and a number of other non-British territories. So to understand indenture, it's important to first step back in time and talk about place. It's easy from our contemporary perspective to see the islands of the Caribbean and Indian Ocean as a kind of periphery. But in addition to the fact that that's not correct now, it's certainly not correct historically and in the period that I'm going to discuss. From the vantage point of the 17th and 18th centuries, they were very much an imperial center and a source of tremendous wealth. That wealth came from sugar, which became incredibly valuable as a commodity and consumer good in Europe. And in sugar colonies like Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, Cuba, to name three of the largest, sugar production depended fundamentally on enslavement. And sorry, just to explain this what this image does is map out routes during the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. And as you can see, the routes to the Caribbean are very, very significant. So this is the important context for understanding abolition in the British Empire. Abolitionism became a political force in Britain towards the end of the 18th century. The first great abolition in this context was, of course, the Haitian Revolution. But Britain was the first European power to abolish chattel slavery in its sugar colonies. And that took place in uneven phases. First, in 1808, Britain abolished the slave trade. Then in 1833-34, slavery itself. As part of abolition, freed people became apprentices, which was a transitional status. But in 1838, apprenticeship was also abolished. So that summer, the summer of 1838, saw full emancipation. But immediately after abolition, and in fact before the end of apprenticeship, planters in British colonies began attempting to recruit indentured workers to bolster their plantation workforces. The imperial state intervened in this process, creating a regulated system of labor migration that then lasted until the end of the First World War. And as I said, that system recruited workers from British India on a very large scale, and it's one of the main reasons why there are large populations of South Asian descent across these parts of the world, in places like Guyana, Mauritius, as I mentioned, South Africa. Indenture was a contractual arrangement that was, in theory, voluntary. As a formal matter, an indenture was a contract, an agreement to work for a period of years in exchange for transportation. But in practice, direct and indirect forms of coercion structured that contractual obligation. Deception played a role in recruitment for many, and most couldn't read the contracts that they signed. Meanwhile, in the colonies, quite elaborate vagrancy and master and servant laws rendered workers who breached their contracts liable to imprisonment. So much of this concerns the role of the colonial state. Indenture was a state-run labor system, not an individually mediated or spontaneous relationship. It was overseen and facilitated by imperial officials, and its purpose was to sustain plantation production in the aftermath of abolition. So my current work as a historian is about the meaning of free labor in this context. And the book that I'm writing began with a fairly simple question. In 1840, the colonial secretary was the head of the department that no longer exists, but responsible for overseeing colonial administration across the empire. The colonial secretary, Lord Russell, refused to allow indentured labor migration to British Guyana, and in so doing he said, "I am not prepared to encounter the responsibility of a measure which may lead to a dreadful loss of life on the one hand, or on the other to a new system of slavery." 20 years later, Russell's successor as colonial secretary, Edward Bulwer Lytton, spoke of indenture in very different terms. Arguing in Parliament, Bulwer Lytton portrayed indenture as morally just. Rather than a new system of slavery, as Russell had termed it, indenture was, in his view, a means of preserving, and I'm quoting him, "the sublime experiment of Negro emancipation." There's also a kind of movement, rhetorical movement from innocence to experience in the quotation, which you might notice, which signals a larger conceptual transformation around the project of emancipation during the 1850s and 60s. So this striking contrast in perspectives raised a series of questions for the book. Why did indenture become less controversial over time? Why did two prominent officials of the same class in the same position, separated only by time, see the issue so differently? In a much broader sense, how did indenture become free labor? In the book, I approach this question from several different perspectives as a matter of ideology, but also as a matter of law and economic structure. But for today, as I said, I'd just like to do two things very briefly. First, I'll present one strand of argument about the law of indenture. And then I'd like to zoom out from my work and try to share some provisional reflections about the history of migration as a field. And for this gathering in particular, I'm interested in thinking about what work based in the 19th century context of empire has to say to work based on, in a 20th century context of nation states, or as we've termed it in the conference, in a world of walls and borders. Oh, sorry, that's the second point. Okay, so the first argument about post-slavery indenture, and to put it very directly, what I'd like to suggest is that notions of increasingly fixed racial difference displaced an early universalism in imperial accounts of post-slavery free labor, and that this happened around the middle of the 19th century with important implications for the legal structure of indenture. And these are just some examples of ordinances, laws of indenture. Each of the colonies had its own body of law, all of which was overseen by London, by the Colonial Office. So in the early 1840s, when the state-sponsored indenture system was created, quite serious disagreement arose over the proper scope and substance of colonial labor law in these post-slavery colonies. And in this context, legislative proposals that originated in the colonies frequently met resistance and in fact, disapproval at the Colonial Office in London. Underlying this conflict, and I think what's the important point, were distinct views of the meaning of free labor, as well as the inherent rights and capacities of non-European workers. So in 1842, the home government sanctioned Indian labor migration to Mauritius under a set of regulations. Private recruitment was banned, public officials were appointed to enforce transport regulations, and labor contracts were limited to 1 year. By 1845, in the colony, in Mauritius, the colony's legislative council had begun to argue very strenuously for longer mandatory contracts. And a consistent racial theme underlay these arguments. According to the council, Indian workers were incapable of orderly work without legal compulsion. They were, as the council reported, quoting, by nature averse and by habit unaccustomed to steady labor. They were marked by a, quote, capricious and roving disposition and prone to absent themselves continuously from the estates, wandering about in idleness. And idleness and industriousness are sort of charged terms in this Victorian context. Increased coercion was thus perceived as necessary, according to the planters who testified before the council. Only an increase, a prolongation, as they said, of engagements to 5 or 3 years could counteract the Indian workers' supposed predisposition to vagrancy. Scholars have sometimes assumed that imperial officials acquiesced to local demands in shaping indenture policy, but interestingly, in this early period, in this early moment, the Colonial Office quite clearly rejected that racialized logic of labor control. And our most dramatic examples in this regard come from dispatches written by a colonial secretary, Earl Grey, who repeatedly disallowed this kind of proposal for longer mandatory contracts. So while, as we saw, local officials insisted upon inherent Indian difference, Grey asserted a more universalistic theory of free labor efficiency. He wrote, "Where the motives of self-interest are properly brought to bear upon their conduct, there are few, if any, among the various races of mankind who may not be stimulated to industry." In this sense, the true policy of indenture, in his view, was to promote labor discipline through self-interest rather than direct legal coercion. Under this framework, and again, much more could be said about this, Grey strictly prohibited contracts lasting longer than 1 year. Disallowing a law to the contrary in British Guyana, he wrote that 3-year contracts plainly amounted to, quote, interference with the freedom of labor. Using a kind of language of industriousness to moralize restrictive labor discipline, the governor of Trinidad argued in 1849 that 5-year contracts would make immigrant workers, quote, worthy of freedom, the source of the title of my book. And Gray's response here was that such a law would represent no less than slavery in a mitigated form and for a limited period. And this is just, they're not all this messy, but this is a set of notes that he wrote to other officials about that law. But despite, despite these clear lines of disagreement, the laws of indenture changed very substantially over time. And in so doing, they became increasingly restrictive. Multi-year contracts, which Grey and others had banned, became the norm. The Colonial Office sanctioned 3-year contracts in 1854, 5-year contracts in 1862, and optional 5-year re-indenture extensions in 1860 and 1863. And penalties for unauthorized absence hardened in a very similar pattern. Trinidad authorized imprisonment with hard labor for up to 3 months for breaches for unauthorized absence in 1865. Natal, following Mauritius, imposed wage deductions in excess of wages due in 1859. And all of this was done at this later stage with London's approval. These changes followed shifts in the imperial sugar economy, most notably decreases in sugar production in the British West Indies, as well as the repeal of the sugar duties in 1846, which lowered the price of sugar on the London market. Both dynamics helped consolidate a new ideological consensus that the sugar colonies were in crisis and that from an economic standpoint, emancipation had failed. Such judgments blended seamlessly into moral condemnation of the formerly enslaved and of the capacities of non-European workers more broadly. So if we flash forward to the 1860s, we see an entirely different approach to the boundaries of free labor in official discussions of indenture. In 1867, Mauritius imposed pass laws on all Indian immigrants, including so-called old immigrants who had finished their indentures and were no longer legally bound. The governor at the time justified that law in explicitly racialized terms. In his view, special legal restrictions were appropriate, quote, for men in the state of civilization of the low-caste natives who emigrate to these colonies. And now the Colonial Office's response to that argument revealed the extent to which officials in London, by this point, had abandoned that earlier, more universalistic conception of free labor, which we saw and come to accept the very race-based justification for legal coercion that had long been advocated in the colonies. Privately, the colonial office official who reviewed this law wrote that it was, quote, extraordinarily stringent, and that it, quote, introduced a principle unknown to and inconsistent with English law. That's because the past laws were explicitly discriminatory on the basis of race. Still, in spite of acknowledging that, that's not just my sort of projection from the present. That's what he wrote at the time. He still regarded it as being both necessary and legitimate. The governor's assessment had much prima facie probability, he wrote, since, quoting him again, the Indians who emigrate to the colonies must necessarily be of the lower class in their native country, a class in which habits of truthfulness and honesty are notoriously deficient. And this is a photograph of a special vagrancy prison that was built in Mauritius at the time, and part of it still exists. It's a photo I took several years ago. So 2 decades earlier, the Colonial Office had explicitly rejected local descriptions of inherent Indian vagrancy, as we saw, insisting instead on the universal applicability of liberal theories of economic behavior. Now, the office evinced a newfound deference towards local expertise, towards those on the spot most capable of forming a judgment. So even though the officer explicitly concluded that the law contravened the principles we have been accustomed to, again, I'm quoting him, the principles we have been accustomed to consider essential to liberty in this country, he approved it nonetheless. And this is an example of a ticket, a kind of pass that was required under these fairly elaborate pass laws enacted in the 1860s. And you can see it has a photograph. It's a quite early use of photography in policing, which interestingly comes from a colonial context, well before photographs were used in passports for international travel. Okay. So I think am I essentially out of time? Okay. So my grand plan for the 2 parts was overambitious, but perhaps in the discussion I can bring in some of the reflections I had prepared about how we might connect this kind of work based in a context of empire in which the state was committed to facilitating migration for the purpose of redistributing labor within an empire, to a quite different 20th century context, which rightly tends to dominate histories of migration, in which we live in a world dominated by nation states, which tend to restrict immigration in their borders and tend to assume that the power to enforce such restriction is inherent in sovereignty. So as a preview, I think one of the big questions and potential contributions some work in this imperial context has to make is to suggest that there's a longer history to that coming together of sovereignty and border restriction, which is essentially a story about transition from empire to nation. So hopefully more time for that later, but thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting us to rethink the meaning of those mandatory contracts with harsh penalties for breaches that include imprisonment. So it's a good way of understanding who or how, like empires, planted the seed for contemporary bracero programs and guest worker programs, both in Europe and also in Latin America. That's a fascinating story that is very worth examining further in the Q&A question. And now we move to our next speaker, Ivon Padilla Rodriguez. She is a Bridge to Faculty postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the Department of History. Ivon is currently working on a book manuscript that historizes child-centered mechanisms and consequences of U.S. immigration exclusion. Her public-facing writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Time, NACLA, and Teen Vogue. Her most recent academic writing includes an article in the Journal of American Ethnic History, and she is also an Illinois Public Voices Fellow. She is going to present her paper, Migrant Child Labor and Debt Peonage on Farms in Post-1965 America. Do you have your slides here?
I sent them to John.
Okay. Yeah.
If
they
not, I
must-
have some
Are
here.
you PPT SAB? Because I don't recall, is migration border, what's the name in the file?
Should have been pretty clear, like child labor.
Oh, migrant child labor in the peonage, but that's not they are not here. Sorry, Bon. I was told
It's
that
okay.
everything is in there, but it's
I
not
sent
there.
it pretty early.
Jonathan's are here, but yours aren't, or unless you can find them here?
I don't think.
I don't find them.
Yeah. Not to fear, I came prepared. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm short. This is always a problem. My presentation today will take us to post-1965 United States. In the summer of 1960, David Shackney traveled to Mexico to hire workers for the large chicken farm he owned in Middlefield, Connecticut. After meeting Luis Oros in Mexico City, Shackney negotiated a 2-year contract with Mr. Oros, Mrs. Oros, and their eldest daughter, Maria Elena, to work on Shackney's chicken farm beginning on August 15, 1961. Shackney then arranged for the Oros family's transportation and visa processing, including the youngest Oros children whose labor was not included in Shackney's contract. Despite only spending $560 on their bus tickets and immigration expenses, Shackney demanded Mr. Oros sign 18 interest-high promissory notes for $100 each as collateral. After securing these promissory notes, Shackney communicated to Mr. Oros the following warning. You have contract. If you break this contract, I deport you and you never come back to the United States. Not you, not your son, and not your grandsons, because I have a lot of friends in Mexico and the United States, and I have a lot of money. In spite of this preemptive threat of deportation, Mr. Oros still wanted to travel to Connecticut as Shackney's employee. But when the Oros family arrived to Middlefield, they quickly realized Shackney had misrepresented the work and living conditions they would endure. To begin with, the Oros living quarters were unsafe for a family with young children. The family was also not permitted to receive visitors or leave the farm's premises without supervision. And despite the fact that their agreement only provided for the labor of Mr. Oros, Mrs. Oros, and Maria Elena, Shackney coerced all 7 members of the family into working on his farm, including the youngest children aged 7 and 9, who never attended school while in Connecticut. The Oros family only received $10 throughout their 2-year stay in Middlefield because Shackney garnished the family's earnings to dissolve the debt owed to him. The exploitation experienced by the Oros family would be considered labor trafficking today. In the 1960s, this kind of labor exploitation, as you can see on the screen, was described within the language of slavery. The labor trafficking of migrants with liminal or no legal status meant that they were recruited and transported to the U.S. through the use of fraud or coercion for the purposes of involuntary servitude and debt bondage or peonage. They were coaxed into taking on debts impossible to pay off and silenced with threats of violence, arrests, or deportation. But when the Oros family challenged their involuntary servitude and debt peonage in court, the Second Circuit ultimately ruled in U.S. v. Shackney that labor trafficking induced by the threat of deportation was not necessarily, quote, equivalent to imprisonment or worse, end quote, since the victims of labor trafficking had to possess an extreme fear of the consequence of formal legal imprisonment to qualify for redress. This reasoning ignored the pleas of the Oros children, who testified to a grand jury that the prison-like conditions of their employment made them, quote, think they were in prison, end quote. The Oros children exploitation marked one of the first, if not the first, documented instance of the attempted prosecution of the labor trafficking of youth from Mexico, a practice whose prevalence was exacerbated by the post-1965 changes to immigration law and policy and their attendant explosion of the human smuggling business. My research expands the rich but adult-centric scholarship on immigration by tracing the inception and growth of migrant youth labor trafficking on farms in the wake of the precedents set by U.S. v. Shackney. It also shows how labor trafficking helped fuel the growth of child detention and deportation by exposing trafficked migrant minors to the carceral state, when immigration raids in the fields resulted in their arrests and detentions. Finally, I reveal how migrant youth challenged these rights violations, as well as how law enforcement and growers weaponized paternalistic ideas about childhood innocence to extend the reach of the carceral state, ensnaring migrants of all ages into its expanding dragnet. Although single adult males numerically dominated the post-1965 growth of unauthorized migration to the U.S., rising inequality, inflation, and unemployment in countries like Mexico forced unaccompanied youth to travel to the U.S. unlawfully in search of work opportunity. In addition, the imposition of numerical limits on Latin American immigration and the preference for refugees fleeing communism forced some families' decision to, quote, reunify themselves illegally, end quote, as one Border Patrol agent put it to a Los Angeles Times reporter in 1979. The lack of avenues available for lawful migration to the U.S. also forced Latin American migrants to undertake clandestine routes to enter the U.S. and evade detection and incarceration in Immigration and Naturalization Service detention centers, INS. As the southwestern U.S. boundary hardened and the presence of immigration agents at urban points of entry increased, migrants required guidance from smugglers knowledgeable of the terrain in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, leading to the explosion of the human smuggling business. By 1975, over 70% of migrants, and especially undocumented minors, purchased the services of a coyote to transport them across the border, which started to become increasingly militarized in the 1970s, resulting in the infliction of fatal violence upon undocumented youth and women at the border. Herman Baca of the Committee on Chicano Rights claimed that the militarization of the border allowed, quote, an armed force of psychopaths to wage war on innocent children, end quote. Impoverished migrants of all ages, but especially children, who could not afford the services of a coyote, sometimes consented to arrangements in which coyote smugglers transported them directly to work in the U.S., usually on rural farms where they hoped to earn a living to send money home and pay back the debt owed for their transportation and smuggling. Commercial farms became one of the most common destination sites for youth, in part because the government continued to carve out labor law exemptions for the agricultural industry, and because enforcement of child labor prohibitions was lax, if not entirely non-existent. Most farm work remained excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act 1938 child labor ban. Additionally, the U.S. didn't invest enough resources into enforcing the 1974 amendments of the ban, making updates to child labor law meaningless. The courts also gave farm owners license to exploit migrant minors' labor. Judges' personal convictions that child labor should be legally permissible because, quote, if you keep a kid occupied, you keep them out of trouble, end quote, were rooted in migrant minors' presumed disposition to criminality and the denial of their childhood. Some growers asserted that they knew what was best for young migrants by maintaining that the kids were, quote, better for it, end quote, since the work kept them occupied, and off the streets where they might pose harm to themselves or worse, to white Americans. These personal convictions and judicial philosophies explain why, when the Department of Labor uncovered 13,000 agricultural child labor violations in 1970, the department only managed to obtain 138 court injunctions against the practice. By sanctioning child labor under the guise of a paternalistic concern for minors depicted as dangerous to themselves and society, judges' interviews revealed how the state legally and rhetorically denied migrant minors childhood innocence to facilitate their continued labor exploitation. When judges did prosecute agricultural child labor violations, often it was migrant parents who bore the brunt of court-ordered fines to discourage them from bringing their kids to the fields and subjecting them to constant migration. In states like Ohio, migrant parents were sometimes incarcerated in county jails for being unable to pay agricultural child labor fines or post bail. Migrant parents' criminalization was justified by judges' paradoxical sense of legal paternalism, in which punishing parents, quote, protected, end quote, innocent children from exploitation, even if the parents' incarceration resulted in family separation. When punishing children for school absenteeism, disciplinary actions were rooted in ideas about neglected minors' immaturity that deemed them dangerous to themselves, necessitating the wisdom of correctional officials. It is against the backdrop of weak anti-child labor law enforcement, an increase in child and family migration, a racist domestic law enforcement apparatus, and the buildup of the deportation regime that local and federal authorities discovered especially egregious instances of undocumented child labor exploitation on farms. Unofficial estimates in the early 1980s suggested that anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 child and adult migrants were labor trafficked every year. Many of these migrants originated from Mexico and increasingly from Central America in the final years of the 20th century. They were trafficked onto remote rural farm fields in the US Southwest, Midwest, and South after traveling along migratory routes inherited from the early and mid-20th century. I argue that farms constituted carceral work sites that extended the reach of the carceral state beyond normative sites of incarceration like prisons and jails. Mid and late 20th century migrant labor camps and farms were prison-like spaces because farm owners like David Shackney denied minors freedom of movement and basic rights to privacy, education, medical attention, and communication with the world outside of the farm's perimeter. I look at how non-traditional sites of imprisonment, in this case labor camps and farms, relied on carceral logics, which I define as the perpetration of surveillance, isolation, curtailed mobility, and punishment, which then brought migrant minors into contact with law enforcement agents. When undocumented workers spoke out against the violence they endured on carceral farm fields or refused to work, growers called local law enforcement. Migrants' advocacy then resulted in state-sponsored retaliation enabled by collaborations between the police and INS, who carried out immigration raids that uncovered undocumented youth workers. By demanding better working conditions, withholding their labor, taking their employers to court, and trying to escape confinement on carceral farm fields, migrant youth challenged agricultural capitalist power and the carceral state's unofficial extensions. But in the process of expressing resistance, migrant youth became increasingly exposed to immigrant detention. In fact, undocumented agricultural child laborers were sometimes incarcerated in county jails and detention centers to serve as material witnesses against their traffickers and smugglers. In a bid to try to thwart the post-1965 increase in unauthorized migration from Latin America, the INS started to prosecute coyotes in court in the late 1960s. This decision did very little to hold accountable well-resourced human smugglers who could secure bail within a single day of arrest. Instead, as authorities attempted to gather material witnesses against coyotes, the decision caused the mass imprisonment of thousands of Mexican and Central American minors. In 1979, 340,000 immigrants were arrested at the border. Of these, more than 8,000 were children, and 600 of them were held as material witnesses to testify in federal court. In the following decade, the INS incarcerated about 5,000 children a year, and an estimated 900 minors were forced to testify against their coyotes each year into the mid-1980s. The detention and eventual deportation of migrant minors in the late 20th century criminalized undocumented youth of all ages and denied them the privilege of childhood innocence, just as labor trafficking had done. In INS jails, undocumented youth received their first criminal records and were incarcerated alongside adults charged with criminal offenses. Their physical proximity to imprisoned adults hardened perceptions of migrant youth as criminal and blurred the lines between adolescence and adulthood. Immigration officials in the US employed paternalistic arguments in which they purported to be protecting children and acting in their, quote, best interests, end quote, by detaining them to prosecute their smugglers and traffickers. Even when the prosecution of coyote smugglers caused a family separation, immigration officials maintained that these efforts were meant to help children and their families. If the INS did acknowledge the cruelty of child incarceration explicitly, they did so to advance another paternalistic argument, that deportation was also in undocumented minors' best interest because removal from the nation allowed for a child's release from prison, which allowed, quote, juveniles to return to Mexico with smiles, end quote, as you can see on the screen. Misleading statements like these failed to acknowledge how expulsion created additional precarity for lone child deportees who were forced to join the ranks of informal day laborers in northern Mexico to earn enough to survive until they could cross the border again, or those who endured a double criminalization by being arrested and thrown into overcrowded juvenile detention facilities in northern Mexico after deportation from the United States. Child detention and labor trafficking ended up inspiring an abolitionist critique of the US immigration regime. Migrants' rights advocates called for a series of accountability measures against employers and a moratorium on arrests and deportations by the Border Patrol and INS in farm fields and orchards, which sometimes resulted in the apprehension of migrant child laborers. In the 1980s, Herman Baca explicitly articulated an abolitionist critique of the immigration regime in response to the harm perpetuated against migrant youth. In a 1985 protest involving 30 children, Baca argued that, quote, the only solution to stopping the abuse of children is to abolish the Border Patrol, end quote. This history shows that rights violations against migrant youth are not new, and that migrant child labor in particular does not constitute a new economy of exploitation, as the New York Times recently put it. While it is true that child labor violations have been on the rise since 2015, there is nothing new about the exploitation and educational deprivation, or even the attempted educational deprivation of migrant youth, let alone their detention. Recent violations of migrant children's rights are part of a decades-long history that is about much more than just labor law and its enforcement. It is also the consequence of restrictive immigration law and the militarization of the border. Failing to look beyond labor law enforcement and scrutinize the entire web of practices, both legal and rhetorical, that have allowed migrant child labor and abuse to flourish in the US will only continue to put children in harm's way, depriving them of the most fundamental rights of childhood. Thanks so much. I'll take it out later.
Thank you so much, Ivon, for bringing the record straight that this is not a new phenomenon what we are reading this on the New York Times these days on child labor. And very quickly, before moving on to our next presenter, I just want to share a story because my students from my labor course are here today, that we recently got a visit from the Department of Labor, Deputy Director of Chicago for the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division to our classroom. And my students were very well prepared and asked him questions about the recent Tyson lawsuit where the undocumented Central American kids had been awarded $1 million, which prompted all this wave of information at the New York Times. And he was like a little evasive because he said that this is still confidential information, but he said that unfortunately, very close by, very close to this place, In Chicago, there is another case of child labor abuse that he could not disclose anymore because the judge had failed to give him an injunction to raid the place. So we had to go to the bed, myself and my students, like learning that very close to where we were at in Chicago, there is another child labor abuse, big one from a big corporation. That's all the information he could tell you. But if you want to pull out your calculator now, you see the scale of Ivon's problem by making a simple math that there are 2,000, and I repeat, 2,000 inspectors from the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor that are in charge of surveillance and like inspecting the entire country. So go figure what type of abuses are out there. Okay, next, we have a wonderful discussant today that is coming to tell us, discuss these papers. Cindy Hahamovitch from the University of Georgia. Cindy Hahamovitch is a professor of history at the University of Georgia. She is a scholar of Southern immigration and labor history in a global context. She is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, and the John E. Sawyer Fellow at the National Humanities Center. She has written 2 books, The Fruits of Their Labor, Atlantic Coast Farm Workers, and the Making of Migrant Poverty, 1870-1945, University of North Carolina Press, and the triple prize winning No Man's Land, Jamaican Guest Workers in America and the Global History of Deportable Labor, from Princeton University Press. So please give a warm welcome to Cindy Hahamovitch.
Thank you so much. This podium wasn't really built for height-challenged people, so I hope you can see me over the top. Thanks so much for having me here, and I want to give another round of applause to the folks who organized this conference. I have organized many, and I can tell you it is a royal pain. Now, both of these fascinating papers deal not just with the experience of migrants, indentured workers in one case, child migrants in another, but with those in power's understanding and treatment of those people. John Connolly considers how British attitudes toward Indian indentured workers hardened over time. And Ivon Padilla shows us that the criminalization and exploitation of child migrants traveling alone is not a new phenomenon. So one reckons with change and one reckons with continuity, right? Now, John's paper is really 2 papers in one, as he said, and the first part is a very useful summary, as you heard, of 19th century indentured labor in the British Empire when there were borders, but not yet walls, right? Focusing on officials changing attitudes toward Indian workers. And then the second part of the essay, which you didn't get to hear, kind of veered away to critique the tendency of historians of migration to focus narrowly on migration between nation states. And he suggests that using migration as a category of analysis in order to see beyond the confines of nation states' borders would be a useful way to think. And in this case, he proposes an empire-wide view of migration. Now, both these pieces are fantastic, and so I don't really have critiques, so I'm just going to riff off them. And if I could have the bottle of water or the cup or whatever, that would be awesome. I don't know where I'm going to put it. So John's is the sort of piece that's really fun to think with, and my first thought was that it substitutes a nation-state frame for a British imperial frame that's narrow in its own way. And I know John's thinking I'm crazy because studying a whole empire is, an enormous undertaking. But it considers one kind of imperial migration, right, indenture, without considering the others, like British migration to the US or South Africa or Hong Kong, or convict migration to Australia. Not that I'm really suggesting you do this, because you'd be done by the time you're 80, but I've never really seen a study that goes truly empire-wide, and I think somebody could do that as a sort of synthetic book, that would be really exciting. We might also get a different impression if we compared indentured migration across empires. In fact, when I give talks about 19th century indentured labor in the British Empire, because I'm working on the same stuff, someone will invariably ask me, well, what about indentured migrants in other empires, as though one was not enough? It's a good question, though, because we don't really know how much colonial officials copied from each other and how they handled the same issues. So to just give you one example, in the British Empire, as indentures got longer and pass laws were imposed on the colonies, as John notes, there was investigation after investigation by the British, and then reform after, so they're reforming themselves constantly. And I don't think those reforms worked by and large, but they allowed British officials to think that they worked, right? And it just sort of prolonged the indentured system, so it lasts all the way until the early 1920s, because they get to think it's better, even when it's not. In contrast, Lisa Yunn's brilliant book, The Coolie Speaks, on Chinese indentured migrants in Cuba, shows that after a similar Chinese investigation into gross abuses of indentured workers in Cuba, the Chinese government shut the whole thing down. Right? Well, why the difference, right? Why would a relatively weak empire do that when a powerful empire like the British kept going and going and going? So a global frame might reveal even more than an imperial frame. And we could just as well challenge the temporal limitations of historians' studies. So indentured labor, as I'm sure you know, was far older than the so-called coolie trade of the 19th century, right? In fact, by the time indentured migrants from India started to move around the world in the 19th century, British and German indentured workers had been crossing the Atlantic to the so-called New World for some 200 years. What's the difference, right? Was this the same recruitment system with different players, or an utterly different traffic in people? How much difference did race make, for example? I would love somebody to do that study. And then if we jump forward to the recent past, how different were the experiences of migrants, say, in the guest worker programs in a world that has both walls and borders? So, and that's really the project that I'm trying to work on, is comparing the 19th and the 20th centuries, and I've run out of hands. Okay. Now, going down to the local level would also allow us, and it sounds like John, I was talking to him earlier, and it sounds like he does this, but would allow us to consider indentured workers and emancipated slaves, thank you, in the same frame. So Africans were still being imported into the Caribbean just 20 years before indentured Indians started to arrive, and indentured workers worked alongside emancipated people. They were housed in the same quarters. They were clearly recruited not to replace emancipated people, but to undermine their bargaining power, right? And yet the history of emancipation and the history of indentured servitude are discussed as they're two different fields, almost entirely. There's a few books that connect the dots, but usually they're just sort of glancing mentions of the relationship, and we really need a study that delves into that comparison. So my point here is not that John is wrong about anything, or about taking immigration historians to task for focusing on nation states. I kind of tried to do that in my own work, but we could propose many different scales, some way more ambitious than others, right? Local, national, transnational, imperial, global. And we could study the longue durée, or we can study the short term, and each has its advantages and its disadvantages. So I'd love to, think more about that. Now, Ivon's paper. Eric Arneson once told me that I was the most depressing labor historian of all time, but I think Ivon might have taken my crown. Her work on the exploitation and incarceration of teenagers crossing the border on their own is eye-opening and horrifying. Ivon's paper raises all sorts of interesting issues that I'd love to read more about. I wonder, for example, how far back you'll go, right? So Sarah Rogerson has a 2016 law review article, and there were a bunch of law review articles I looked on this topic on unaccompanied minors. And she begins with a citation for a 1939 congressional hearing on unaccompanied minors, but that seemed to be about Jewish refugee children coming from Nazi Germany. And I'm pretty sure I've seen progressive era reporting on European unaccompanied minors arriving in the US, although I couldn't find it in my quick look. So this made me wonder how differently policymakers, reporters, academics, and others have treated the issue of child migrants, depending on where the migrants are from. So, another issue I'd love to know more about, and I should be trying to sell this as a dissertation topic forever, but nobody ever listens to my ideas for dissertation topics, so yeah, whatever, is to really dig in on the people who bring these children over the border, or bring migrants over the border, who in this article are called coyotes, smugglers, human traffickers, and labor recruiters. And it occurred to me as I was reading that sometimes we see the people who facilitate migration as heroes, right? I'm thinking, for example, as the conductors on the Underground Railroad, right? They're kind of doing the same job, but in a totally different context. Or the people who used to help facilitate migration over the US-Mexican border, but whose actions, whose aid has been criminalized, right, in recent decades. So in this case, and in most cases, we talk about people who move people across borders as smugglers or traffickers, as Ivon does here. But if you believe that people have the right to cross borders and shouldn't be criminalized for doing it, then are the people who facilitate their crossings heroes or villains or something in between? And by the way, in international law, there's a distinction made between smugglers and traffickers, which I must say is pretty darn muddy. But anyway, it's worth thinking about the distinction. So I'm really interested in a study of facilitation that goes from, say, the slave trade to the present, right? Rather than, just we have work on coyotes, but I don't think we have a lot of work. And we have slave traders, but there's so much in between. And I'm glad to know that you're working on a sort of 1965 divide, because I've thought about this in relation to 1986. So when H-2A workers, agricultural guest workers, I'm fine, were, but before 1986, before IRCA, they were restricted to apples and sugar, so just to a few employers, really. And at that time, all the workers were coming from the British Caribbean, and employers did the recruiting and the facilitating themselves. They formed labor consortiums. They sent recruiters down to Jamaica and other formerly British colonies. And it was far less pernicious than this recruiting is today. But it also allowed them to blacklist workers who organized strikes or who sought out lawyers. So there was a up and a downside. And then after 1986, when the H-2A program was allowed to expand into any crop and to bring people from any sending country, we get all these private recruiters getting into the business, and it gets seriously nasty, as it is today. So I'm hoping that Ivon's work will historicize this issue of facilitators. And then the last issue I want to raise is that Ivon's use of incarceration as a frame for understanding both the exploitation of child migrants on farms and their treatment in immigration detention, which she says is, frightfully like the treatment of immigration adults, maybe as a metaphor doesn't quite cover all of the things that you're talking about. So it seemed to me that your story was a story of mobility and immobility. The incarceration metaphor kind of captures the immobility part, but employers hire these kids, so they're depending on their mobility, even as they may immobilize them after they get there. And likewise, private detention centers depend on people's mobility in order to profit from their detention, from their immobility. So I wondered if there was maybe somebody can, I'm terrible at metaphors, maybe somebody can suggest one later, but I was just mulling about that. So anyway, just a few thoughts on these really fascinating papers, and I look forward to learning from both of these authors and to read their published work. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being so good on timing, because now gets the good part when we get to interact with the panelists. So we have exactly 15 minutes for Q&A, and this is a very large room, so I counted 76 persons. So I'm happy to facilitate the discussion, and hopefully we will get a first round of questions. So while we don't collect a first round, and I will call you, and then we let them speak, and then if we have time, we do a second round. How about that? Over there. First question. You get the first question? Oof, that's a good question. The text, does the person who asks questions need a mic? Because I don't have a portable one. Oh, we have a spare? Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. That was really spectacular. I'm Jenny Breyer. I'm in Gender and Women's Studies and the History Department. I know all of you. I actually was really fascinated with how abolition appeared in your papers and what it says about this particular moment in a recasting of abolition in our present moment around a particular politics. And always knowing its roots in enslavement. But of course, Ivon's work suggests all of the ways that deportation and other forms of exploitation and oppression require abolition as well. And so I wonder if that's actually another thing that your work, and in a conference on mobility and immobility, to take up abolition in this historical context, which is very different than the historical context that you might immediately associate with abolitionist politics, whether it's in the 18th century or the 21st. So I'm just wondering if you saw that there, because it was palpable for me.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Julie. You will pass the mic. Okay, so let's collect 3 questions. So hopefully we can do 2 rounds. Raise your hand. Don't be shy. We need to this is very short the time. And hand number 3 can please start thinking about the number 3 so that we can have 2 rounds.
Hi, thank you again for your presentation. It was great. I actually have a question about sort of the idea of coercion in your papers. So sort of in both instances, right, people are getting coerced into these contracts, whether it's tricked or sort of physically forced into them. And sort of when people are talking about that, right, these colonial officials being like, well, they sort of, they're lazy, is part of that because they were coerced, like the understanding of they were susceptible to being coerced. And then same for these farm migrants, right? Because they're seen as, these children, sort of, they're losing their innocence. But is that idea is, because, they fell to these tricks, they were forced into this work, does that go into these understandings of them as sort of these lesser workers?
Thank you. A third and last question for first round. Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the presentators. My question is brief, and it concerns about the profits and things associated with these industries. And I imagine that calculating this with the first phenomenon might be more complicated, but it will be interesting to have an approximation.
Thank you very much for these 3 wonderful questions. So I'll call, do you want to do order from right to left, left to right? Do you have a preference for addressing?
No, I'm happy to go first.
Okay. Thank you, Ivon.
Thank you so much for the reflections, the questions. I thought they were really rich and they give me a lot to think through. And thank you for your questions from the audience. For the sake of time, I'll try to be brief to try to get through the audience questions. Abolition in this historical context, as I mentioned in the paper, certainly comes up, and you're right, Jenny, that this isn't perhaps the historical context that you generally think about abolition. I think my first thought would be like the abolition movement around enslavement, and it's really interesting to think about that in conjunction with the abolitionist critiques that were marshaled by the defenders of migrant children and migrant adults, because they often did call upon rhetoric and ideology from that movement of abolition around enslavement. I mean, the language of slavery was really like across the historical archive when describing this kind of labor exploitation. It was often couched in that language, and they would often compare enslavement to the violent exploitation of migrant youth. Some people, even like growers themselves, would say like really horrific things about how they used to, quote, own their slaves and now they just rented them, end quote. I mean, like really, really horrific language to describe the conditions in which they placed migrant youth. And I'm also just like really curious about how, and struck by the fact that abolitionist critiques of the US immigration regime are also like, they don't start with the Abolish ICE movement, that there is like a longer history of this. The question about coercion is a very, very good question. I think the lines here between consent and coercion are super blurry because some of these kids are consenting to these arrangements in where this process begins, but they're certainly not consenting to what actually ends up happening. So these labor arrangements are rooted and dependent upon things like fraud and coercion. And then there's, of course, the questions of like the really like the desperation that they're experiencing and like the power dynamics and the power differentials. So it's complex, and it's something that I'm like trying to very carefully draw out in the written work itself. And often, I think if I understood correctly, youth's supposed like immaturity, their innocence, that also really played a factor in how the coercion and the consent was described. And that's where the state comes in with these very like paternalistic kind of arguments about their ability to supposedly protect kids who are not capable of engaging in these kinds of arrangements. In terms of profits, there's some, so of course, like growers were profiting from these kids' labor. Sometimes kids or states uncovered a lot of evidence of wage theft. There's a particular experiment that the INS engaged with that I didn't bring up in this paper, but it comes up in my broader work. Between 1966 and 1971, the INS experimented with this farming out program where they basically rented detained migrants back to farms. And I think that even the INS was profiting from some of this labor exploitation that was happening on remote commercial farms. So that's what I'll say on profit.
Thank you, Ivon. Now, John.
Thanks so much for, fantastic questions. And on the question of abolition, absolutely crucial for this work, and one of my basic starting points is the fact that abolition ends chattel slavery without defining freedom in any sort of specific way. And to expand on what Cindy said, traditionally much work on indenture thought about the extent to which it resembled slavery. At this point, I think it is potentially more productive to think about the relationship between indenture and emancipation, meaning indenture is one of several major developments that does that work of defining what freedom will actually mean, and not just for indentured workers, because, again, as you said, the effect on all those who lived in these colonies is manifest in wages, in policing, and other respects. And there's maybe a tendency as well to know but not explain the fact that abolitionist politics in Britain become less influential over the course of the 19th century. And that's something I'm very interested in trying to explain. I think the study of indenture lends itself to that, to actually ground that what's often referred to as just decline or fade in a set of economic conflicts over post-slavery labor. And so maybe relatedly to jump to the, the excellent question of profit, in this context, sugar remains the key commodity and the source of profit in the plantation economy. And one thing that the study of indenture reveals is that that continues to be the case in the places where indenture happened on a large scale. And we sometimes miss that because sugar production gradually decreases in Jamaica. And to speak to inter-imperial relationships, the opposite is happening in other parts of the world, in Cuba in particular, which becomes the world's largest sugar producer, and where formal slavery still exists in this period. Creating a kind, what comes to be defined as a kind of free labor that will compete with formal slavery in other empires is another important element of this history. And then I think, a fantastic question about coercion, what it means, and a lot to say. One potential connection to the other forms of indenture that had existed previously is to, first of all, acknowledge that coercion is a part of labor law in England, across Europe, from the Middle Ages forward, that our contemporary distinction between criminal and civil, hasn't fully formed. But I think in the 19th century, there's an important divergence where master and servant law in England is gradually repealed over the course of the century. Indenture to North America for Europeans also, is winding down and ceases to play a role in U.S. labor relations by the 19th century. The opposite is the case in this kind of post-slavery labor. So I think consent becomes a hallmark of freedom for some, but not others in this moment. And the overwhelming view of coercion among officials in the context I deal with is that coercion is actually a means of correcting the predisposition to idleness. So that quote I mentioned briefly, the worthy of freedom, the view of freedom in that context is not what we would generally think of today.
Thank you, John. Cindy, is there anything you want to add?
No, but I want to ask a question, so
Oh,
I'll wait to
okay.
see how many are out
Good.
there first.
That's good. So are there any from the audience, another round, or you? Okay, we have time for two questions,
worry, I can
yours
always ask
and,
later.
and that one. So Anthony.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. I was hoping you could reflect on the ways that, in the aftermath of abolition, migration and the importation of new labor served as a mechanism to marginalize formerly enslaved and now emancipated peoples. I'm thinking of the example of Brazil, where after 1888, the abolition of slavery, we see the importation of Southern Europeans as a way to replace black labor and to whiten the labor force. And I was interested in if we see this kind of phenomenon occurring in other contexts.
Thank you, Anthony. And then Cindy, and then we close. Your question, Cindy, and then
Oh,
we
yeah.
go back to
Thank you. I was going to say there's lots of evidence of the same phenomenon here in the U.S. So Moon Ho Jung's book on the importation of Chinese indentured workers into the Louisiana area after emancipation is a similar example. And then there's an immigrant train that drives around the South trying to encourage the importation of immigrants from Europe to supplant African Americans. It doesn't work, of course, but it's the same idea. So my question was about the issue of regulation and enforcement. So I was thinking of Xóchitl's point earlier about there being only 2,000 labor inspectors around the country, and if you, let's say there was magical funding that came from above, and that was increased tenfold, that's still nowhere near enough people to visit every farm, every workplace. So I wonder what you think, when you're writing about this stuff, how you think in terms of solutions. And it's a total counterfactual question, but I get asked this all the time. So what does a good guest worker program look like?
Yeah.
And my first answer is always, well, open the borders, that would be better. And then people look at me like, we didn't want a John Lennon song, right? We wanted policy, like what do I write in the legislation? And so I've been thinking about this for years, so I wonder what you guys think.
Thank you, Cindy. Just to help the panelists answer, just let me clarify that the ILO condemns the U.S. because ILO says that the U.S. doesn't have enough. So ILO says that we are outside of the norm. So go back to John and Ivon, who wants to close.
Okay, yeah, why not? Maybe I'll address your question, which I think is fantastic. So while in theory, the purpose of this regulated migration wasn't to replace freed people, the former workers, in practice, it did have a kind of effect like that over time. And I think the key, there's a lot more to say, but a sort of key distinction is that freed people were able to bargain and to alter their relationship to the plantations in particular, in a way which indenture by design, the whole legal apparatus surrounding indenture was designed to prevent people from doing that. That created a kind of, eventually, a kind of class-based conflict that was transposed into race in some of these places. But for instance, when freed people went on strike to demand higher wages, the planters' solution was to rely increasingly on indentured workers who could not go on strike. The punishment for illegal absence, any sort of striking counted as legal absence, was imprisonment, and imprisonment with some form of labor attached to it generally. And then in terms of Brazil, I think it would be fantastic to have greater dialogue generally between work on emancipation in Brazil and emancipation in this context, both because of the timing and the question of Brazilian slavery is very much on the mind of many of those in the British context before abolition happens in Brazil. Later on, I think there's some different dynamics where there's some purposeful whitening projects and sort of, there are some, I think, distinctive elements to the kinds of migration that you were signaling in Brazil, as well as some potential similarities.
Yvonne, last words.
Cindy asks a really great question about regulation and enforcement. I also get asked this question a lot. Very recently, I feel like I've been asked this question because of the New York Times reporting on migrant child labor. The history that I study shows me that things like regulation and enforcement and increased prosecution result in the prosecution of migrant parents rather than corporations. They act with a lot of impunity. They have a lot of political influence. There was even a Washington Post article pretty recently that demonstrates that this is still the case. It was like a really close study of a Guatemalan girl who was exploited and who unfortunately, like in her case, her parents were the ones who ended up getting punished for what was happening, for not taking her to school, for subjecting her to the dangers of migration. It seems to me that the only answer here is to force policymakers to open up pathways to lawful entry, to safe entry. Otherwise, people will continue to have to pursue clandestine routes, routes in which unscrupulous actors might take advantage of them. I mean, I'm on the same page as Cindy. Opening up the borders is the solution.
Thank you very much. So this concludes the panel. Please give a warm applause to all panelists. Thank you very much.